Good morning. We have another story today. This one is called Cedric, one of James Harriot's dog stories. Can you see? Okay. The voice at the other end of the phone was oddly hesitant. Mr. Harriot, I should be grateful if you would come and see my dog. It was a woman, obviously upper class. Certainly, what's the trouble? Well, he seems to suffer from a certain amount of flatus. I beg your pardon? There was a long pause. He has excessive flatus. In what way exactly? Well, I suppose you describe it as windiness. The voice had begun to tremble. I thought I could see a gleam of light. You mean his stomach? No, not his stomach. He passes a considerable quantity of wind from a note of desperation had crept in. Ah, yes. All became suddenly clear. I quite understand, but that doesn't sound very serious. Is he ill? No, he's very fit in other ways. Well then, do you think it's necessary for me to see him? Oh, yes, indeed, Mr. Harriot. I wish you would come as soon as possible. It has become quite a problem. All right, I said, I'll look in this morning. Can I have your name and address, please? It's Mrs. Rumney, the Laurels. The Laurels was a very nice house on the edge of the town, standing back from the road in a large garden. Mrs. Rumney herself let me in, and I felt a shock of surprise at my first sight of her. It wasn't just that she was strikingly beautiful. There was an unworldly air about her. She would be around 40, but had the appearance of a heroine in a Victorian novel. Tall, willowy, ethereal. And I could understand immediately her hesitation on the phone. Everything about her suggested fastidiousness and delicacy. Cedric is in the kitchen, she said. I'll take you through. I had another surprise when I saw Cedric. An enormous boxer hurled himself on me in delight, clawing at my chest with the biggest feet I had seen for a very long time. I tried to fight him off, but he kept at me, panting ecstatically into my face and wagging his entire rear end. Sit down, boy, the lady said sharply, as Cedric took absolutely no notice. She turned to me nervously. He's so friendly. Yes, I said breathlessly, I can see that. I finally managed to push the huge animal away and backed into a corner for safety. How often does this excessive flatus occur? As if in reply, an almost palpable sulphurous wave arose from the dog and eddied around me. It appeared that the excitement of seeing me had activated Cedric's weakness. I was up against the wall and unable to obey my first instinct to run for cover, so I held my hand over my face for a few moments before speaking. Is that what you meant? Mrs. Rumney waved a lace handkerchief under her nose, and the faintest flush crept into the pallor of her cheeks. Yes, she replied, almost inaudibly. Yes, that's it. Oh, well, I said briskly, there's nothing to worry about. Let's go into the other room and we'll have a word about his diet and a few other things. It turned out that Cedric was getting rather a lot of meat, and I drew up a little chart cutting down the protein and adding extra carbohydrates. I prescribed a kaolin antacid mixture to be given night and morning and left the house in a confident frame of mind. It was one of those trivial things, and I had entirely forgotten it when Mrs. Rumney phoned again. I'm afraid Cedric is no better, Mr. Harriot. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Is he still? Yes. I spent a few moments in thought. I tell you what, I don't think I can do any more by seeing him at the moment, but I think you should cut out his meat completely for a week or two. Keep him on biscuits and brown bread rusked in the oven. Try him with that and vegetables, and I'll give you some powder to mix in his food. Perhaps you'd call around for it. The powder was a pretty strong, absorbent mixture, and I felt sure it would do the trick, but a week later, Mrs. Rumney was on the phone again. There's absolutely no improvement, Mr. Harriot. The tremble was back in her voice. I do wish you'd come round to see him again. I couldn't see much point in viewing this perfectly healthy animal again, but I promised to call. I had a busy day, and it was after 6 o'clock before I got round to the Laurels. There were several cars in the drive, and when I went into the house, I saw that Mrs. Rumney had a few people in for drinks. People like herself, upper class and of obvious refinement. In fact, I felt rather a lout in my working clothes among the elegant gathering. Mrs. Rumney was about to lead me through to the kitchen when the door burst open and Cedric bounded delightedly into the mix of the company. Within seconds, an anesthetic-looking gentleman was frantically beating off the attack as the great feet ripped down his waistcoat. He got away at the cost of a couple of buttons, and the boxer turned his attention to one of the ladies. She was in imminent danger of losing her dress when I pulled the dog off her. Pandemonium broke out in the graceful room. The hostess's plaintive appeals rang out above the cries of alarm as the big dog charged around, but very soon I realized that a more insidious element had crept into the situation. Uh-oh. The atmosphere in the room became rapidly charged with an unmistakable effluvium, and it was clear that Cedric's unfortunate malady had reasserted itself. I did my best to shepherd the animal out of the room, but he didn't seem to know the meaning of obedience, and I chased him in vain. And as the embarrassing minutes ticked away, I began to realize for the first time the enormity of the problem which confronted Mrs. Rumney. Most dogs break wind occasionally, but Cedric was different. He did it all the time, and while his silent emanations were perhaps more treacherous, there was no doubt that the audible ones were painfully distressing in company like this. Cedric made it worse because at each rasping expulsion, he would look round inquiringly at his back end, then gambol about the room as though the fugitive zephyr was clearly visible to him and he was determined to corner it. It seemed a year before I got him out of there. Mrs. Rumney held the door wide as I finally managed to steer him towards it, but this big dog wasn't finished yet. On his way out, he cocked a leg swiftly and directed a powerful jet against an immaculate trouser leg. After that night, I threw myself into the struggle of Mrs. Rumney's behalf. I felt she desperately needed my help, and I made frequent visits and tried innumerable remedies. I consulted my colleague Siegfried on the problem, and he suggested a diet of charcoal biscuits. Cedric ate them in vast quantities with evident enjoyment, but they, like everything else, made not the slightest difference to his condition. And all the time I pondered upon the enigma of Mrs. Rumney. She had lived in Darrowby for several years, but the townsfolk knew little about her. It was a matter of debate whether she was a widow or separated from her husband, but I was not interested in such things. The biggest mystery to me was how she ever got involved with a dog like Cedric. It was difficult to think of any animal less suited to her personality. Apart from this regrettable affliction, he was in every way the opposite to herself. A great, thick-headed, rumbustious extrovert, totally out of place in her gracious menage. I never did find out how they came together, but on my visits I found that Cedric had one admirer at least. He was Con Fenton, a retired farm worker who did a bit of jobbing gardening and spent an average of 3 days a week at the Laurels. The boxer romped down the drive after me as I was leaving, and the old man looked at him with undisguised admiration. "By gaw," he said, "he's a fine dog, is that." "Yes, he is, Con. He's a good chap, really, and I meant it. You couldn't help liking Cedric when you got to know him. He was utterly amiable and without vice, and he gave off a constant aura of merely of noxious vapors, but of bonhomie. When he tore off people's buttons or sprinkled their trousers, he did it in a spirit of the purest amity." "Just look at them limbs," breathed Con, staring rapturously at the dog's muscular thighs. "By heck, he can jump over that gate as if it weren't there. He what a called a dog." As he spoke, it struck me that Cedric would be likely to appeal to him because he was very like the boxer himself. not overburdened with brains, built like an ox with powerful shoulders and a big, constantly grinning face. They were two of a kind. Alas like it when the missus lets him out into garden, Con went on. He always spoke in a particularly snuffling manner. He's grand company. I looked at him narrowly. No, he wouldn't be likely to notice Cedric's compliance since he always saw him out of doors. On my way back to the surgery, I brooded on the fact that I was achieving absolutely nothing with my treatment. And though it seemed ridiculous to worry about a case like this, there was no doubt the thing had begun to prey on my mind. In fact, I began to transmit my anxieties to Siegfried. As I got out of the car, he was coming down the steps of Skeldale House, and he put a hand on my arm. "You've been to the Laurels, James?" "Tell me," he inquired solicitously, "how is your farting boxer today?" "Still at it, I'm afraid," I replied, and my colleague shook his head in commiseration. We were both defeated. Maybe if chlorophyll tablets had been available in those days, they might have helped, but as it was, I had tried everything. It seemed certain that nothing would alter the situation, and it wouldn't have been so bad if the owner had been anybody else but Mrs. Rumney. I found that even discussing the thing with her had become almost unbearable. Siegfried's student brother Tristan didn't help either. When seeing practice, he was very selective in cases he wished to observe, but he was immediately attracted to Cedric's symptoms and insisted on coming with me on one occasion. I never took him again because as we went in the big dog bounded from his mistress's side and produced a particularly sonorous blast as if in greeting. Tristan immediately threw a hand in dramatic gesture and exclaimed, "Speak on, sweet lips that never told a lie." That was his only visit. I had enough trouble without that. I didn't know it at the time, but a greater blow awaited me. A few days later, Mrs. Rumney was on the phone again. "Mr. Harriot, a friend of mine, has such a sweet little boxer, female. She wants to bring her along to be mated with Cedric." "Eh?" "She wants to mate her with my dog." "With Cedric?" I clutched at the end of the desk. It couldn't be true. "And are you agreeable?" "Yes, of course." I shook my head to dispel the feeling of unreality. I found it incomprehensible that anyone should want to reproduce Cedric, and I gaped into the receiver. A frightening vision floated before me of 8 little Cedrics, all with his complaint. But of course, such a thing wasn't hereditary. I took a grip of myself and cleared my throat. "Very well then, Mrs. Rumney, you better go ahead." There was a pause. "But, Mr. Harriot, I want you to supervise the mating." "Oh, really? I don't think that's necessary." I dug my nails into my palm. "I think you'll be all right without me." "Oh, but I would be much happier if you were there. Please come," she said appealingly. Instead of emitting a long-drawn groan, I took a deep breath. "Right," I said. "I'll be along in the morning." All that evening, I was obsessed by a feeling of dread. Another acutely embarrassing session was in store with this exquisite woman. Why was it I always had to share things like this with her? And I really feared the worst. Even the daffest dog, when confronted with a girl in heat, knows instinctively how to proceed. But with a really ivory-skulled animal like Cedric, I wondered. And the next morning, all my fears were realized. The female, Trudy, was a trim little creature and showed every sign of willingness to cooperate. Cedric, on the other hand, though obviously delighted to meet her, gave no hint of doing his part. After sniffing over her, he danced around her a few times, goofy face, tongue lolling. Then he had a roll on the lawn before charging at her and coming to a full stop. Big feet outsplayed, head down, ready to play. I sighed. It was as I thought. The big chump didn't know what to do. This pantomime went on for some time, and inevitably the emotional strain brought on a resurgence of his symptoms. Frequently he paused to inspect his tail as though he had never heard noises like that before. He varied his dancing routine with occasional headlong gallops round the yard, and it was after he had done about 10 successive laps that he seemed to decide he ought to do something about the female. I held my breath as he approached her, but unfortunately he chose the wrong end to commence operations. Trudy had put up with his nonsense with great patience, but when she found him busily working away in the region of her left ear, it was too much. With a shrill yelp, she nipped him in the hind leg, and he shot away in alarm. After that, whenever he came near, she warned him off with bared teeth. Clearly, she was disenchanted with her bridegroom, and I couldn't blame her. "I think she's had enough, Mrs. Rumney," I said. I certainly had had enough, and so had the poor lady, judging by her slight breathlessness, flushed cheeks, and waving handkerchief. Yes, I suppose you're right," she replied. So Trudy was taken home, and that was the end of Cedric's career as a stud dog. This last episode decided me. I had to have a talk with Mrs. Rumney, and a few days later I called in at the Laurels. "Maybe you'll think it's none of my business," I said, "but I honestly don't think Cedric is the dog for you. In fact, he's so wrong for you that he is upsetting your life." Mrs. Rumney's eyes widened. "Well, he is a problem in some ways, but what do you suggest?" "I think you should get another dog in his place, maybe a poodle or a corgi, something small or something you could control." "But Mr. Harriot, I couldn't possibly have Cedric put down." Her eyes filled quickly with tears. "I am really fond of him despite everything." No, of course not," I said. "I like him too. He has no malice in him. But I think I have a good idea. Why not let Con Fenton have him?" "Con?" "Yes, he admires Cedric tremendously, and the big fellow would have a good life with the old man. He has a couple of fields behind his cottage and keeps a few beasts. Cedric could run to his heart's content out there, and Con would be able to bring him along when he does the garden. You'd still see him 3 times a week." Mrs. Rumney looked at me in silence for a few moments, and I saw in her face the dawning of relief and hope. "You know, Mr. Harriot, I think that could work very well, but are you sure Con would take him?" "I'd like to bet on it. An old bachelor like him must be lonely. There's only one thing worries me. Normally, they only meet outside, and I wonder how he would be when they were indoors and Cedric started to... when the old trouble..." "Oh, I think that would be all right," Mrs. Rumney broke in quickly. "When I go on holiday, Con takes him for a week or 2 and has never mentioned anything unusual in that way." I got up to go. "Well, that's fine. I should put it to the old man right away." Mrs. Rumney rang within a couple days. Con had jumped at the chance of taking on Cedric, and the pair had apparently settled in happily together. She had also taken my advice and acquired a poodle puppy. I didn't see the new dog till it was nearly 6 months old, and its mistress asked me to call to treat it for a slight attack of eczema. As I sat in the graceful room looking at Mrs. Rumney, cool, poised, tranquil, with the little white creature resting on her knee, I couldn't help feeling how right and fitting the whole scene was. The lush carpet, the trailing velvet curtains, the fragile tables with their load of expensive china and framed miniatures. It was no place for Cedric. Con Fenton's cottage was less than half a mile away, and on my way back to the surgery, on impulse, I pulled up at the door. The old man answered my knock, and his big face split into delighted grins when he saw me. "Come in, young man," he cried in his strange, snuffly voice. "I'm right glad to see thee." I had hardly stepped into the tiny living room when a hairy form hurled itself upon me. Cedric hadn't changed a bit, and I had to battle my way to the broken armchair by the fireside. Con settled down opposite, and when the boxer leaped to lick his face, he clumped his companionably on the head with his fist. "Sit down, ye great daft bugger," he murmured with affection. Cedric sank happily onto the tattered hearth rug at his feet and gazed up adoringly at his new master. "Well, Mr. Harriot," Con went on as he cut up some villainous-looking plug tobacco and began to stuff it into his pipe, "I am right grateful to ye for getting me this grand dog. By gaw, he's a topper, and I wouldn't sell him for any money. No man could ask for a better friend." Well, that's great, Con, I said, and I see that big chap is really happy here. The old man ignited his pipe, and a cloud of acrid smoke rose to the low, blackened beams. Aye, he's hardly ever inside. A girt, strong dog like him wants to work its energy off like. But just at that moment, Cedric was obviously making something else off, because the familiar pungency rose from him even above the billowing from the smoke from the pipe. Con seemed oblivious of it, but in the enclosed space, I found it overpowering. Well, I gasped. I just looked in for a moment to see how you were getting on together. I must be on my way. I rose hurriedly and stumbled toward the door, but the redolence followed me in a wave. As I passed the table with the remains of the old man's meal, I saw what seemed to be the only form of ornament in the cottage, a cracked vase holding a magnificent bouquet of carnations. It was a way of escape, and I buried my nose in their fragrance. Con watched me approvingly. Aye, they're lovely flowers, aren't they? To Mrs. at Laurel's lets me bring what I want, and I reckon them carnations is my favorite. Con watched me approvingly. Yes, they're a credit to you. I still kept my nose among the blooms. There's only one thing, the old man said pensively. I don't get the full benefit of 'em. How's that, Con? He pulled at his pipe a couple of times. Well, you can hear a speak bit funny like. No, not really. I do. I've been like it ever since I were a lad. I had an operation for adenoids and summat went wrong. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, I said. Well, it's not serious, but it's left me lacking in one way. You mean? A light was beginning to dawn in my mind, an elucidation of how man and dog had found each other, of why their relationship was so perfect, of the certainty of their happy future together. It seemed like fate. Aye, the old man went on sadly. I have no sense of smell. Good thing, right? The acute embarrassment I felt about Cedric's unfortunate weakness was due mainly to the fact that Mrs. Rumney was so exquisite and unworldly. It was agony to try to discuss such an earthly matter with her. But there is another thing. 40 years ago, this subject was considered unmentionable in polite society. It is very different now, and this fact was brought home to me forcibly when a charming old lady came up to me in a shop in Harrogate and put her hand on my arm. Oh, Mr. Harriot, she said, I did so love your story about the farting boxer. And that's the end of that. Well, as your mom says, a family that farts together stays together, so I think this is the perfect story for the Harrelsons. I love you. I'll talk to you again.